Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Lewicki. After a moment of confusion, major efforts are now underway to bolster Ukraine's continuing efforts to fend off invading Russian forces. However, there appears to be North Korea-sized elephant in the room, with Pyongyang and Moscow expanding their cooperation into new fields. Why are the two authoritarian states joining forces now, and does the West have any recipe to counter Putin and Kim's blooming strategic bromance? Joining us now is Ra Mason, Associate Professor of International Relations and Japanese Foreign Policy at the University of East Anglia, Norwich. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So let's begin with the basics. Russia and North Korea are not really hiding their cooperation anymore, are they?
No, they're absolutely not. I mean, this is obviously a very long-standing relationship which goes back to the Cold War era, and one which has had fluctuations since, but it's now become much more prominent.
But they had been quite reticent about military cooperation in particular, with Moscow often denying any sort of involvement initially. Well, now that we have troops essentially fighting on the front lines, North Korean troops, it has become somewhat impossible to deny, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely impossible to deny, or certainly there is a problem with plausible deniability. But I'm not sure that Russia really anymore cares that much, particularly in terms of, for example, reputation with Western states, which, after all, it can't deal with directly anyway because of the sanctions regime that's currently in place. So the incentive for Russia to cover that up or somehow obfuscate is massively reduced, and the incentive to create a kind of unified axis, which consists essentially of Russia, China, North Korea, and like-minded partners, is increased. Hence, we see the more obvious and open use and kind of extension of Russia-North Korea relations.
Now that you mentioned China, this is another elephant in the room here, although one that has been trying to pretend like it's not there. What role does China play in this relationship? Because it has often been emphasized that North Korea would not be where it is if it wasn't for China.
Yeah, that's very much the case. And in fact, North Korea, if we think about it, has positioned itself now so that it can potentially play Russia and China off against each other. So as I mentioned, North Korea was originally very much held up by Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then. Then in the post-Soviet era, the post-Cold War era, China became its principal and almost only major supporting nation. And so North Korea became utterly reliant upon China. So now with the war in Ukraine and the need for artillery and labor, which North Korea can supply, and on the North Korean side, the need for Russian weapons technology, you have an obvious rapprochement and a motivation on both sides to closen that relationship. And what that does is also allow North Korea to diversify its economy and geopolitical stance and rely less on China. So it's hugely beneficial to North Korea potentially, apart from obviously those poor North Korean conscripts that are thrown into the meat grinder of war in Ukraine.
And of course, there is the disturbing conclusion here that it might be difficult to do anything about this alliance because none of the participating states has any incentives to stop.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, North Korea is an almost utterly totalitarian state, meaning that, we can think of concepts like Michel Foucault's biopower really in action here, whereby an entire population is being exploited and used pretty ruthlessly for its labor. As far as we know, North Korean soldiers on the front line in Ukraine are not being given anything like accurate information about where they're going, let alone about what they're going to be engaged in, often being told that they're going to be involved in logistics or supply and intelligence and this kind of thing. And in fact, they're being put on the front line of the worst war in Europe since World War II. So yes, it's very difficult to see how that can be stopped, even compared to how the situation might be in Russia or China, where there would be at least more pushback against this kind of use of labor on a battlefield.
So that sounds rather dystopian, but it also rings true, knowing how the North Korean regime has been behaving. Now, what would you say the West should do about this? Does the West even have any sort of idea how to confront this problem? Or are we just trying to sweep it under the rug and just pretend like it doesn't exist? After all, we've got North Korean troops in the Ukrainian war, which, well, some people say, well, if this is not a world war kind of situation, then what is?
Yeah, I think in one sense it is a World War situation. I mean, nobody is going to declare World War III, but we now have an incredibly unstable situation in the Middle East. We have an ongoing, very deadly war in Ukraine and increasing pressure points elsewhere, such as in the Taiwan Straits and so on. So we are slowly but unfortunately grinding towards World War III as it stands. And so I think it's about trying to limit or contain some of the most dangerous flashpoints, one of which, of course, remains Ukraine. And in terms of actually addressing the fact that there are, foreign, essentially non-voluntary troops on the battlefield, that's something that's very difficult for Western powers to do. One thing that they have done, and at least the Ukrainian armed forces have done to a certain extent, is to encourage desertions by the North Korean troops. And we have already seen a few of those. So there are cases where North Koreans have defected to the Ukrainian side, but that's very difficult, not least because, they are literally shot in the back if they attempt to do so. So it's a very dangerous and precarious pursuit. But obviously, the more North Koreans can be, in inverted commas, rescued from the battlefield, the more the information can slowly but surely seep into North Korea itself and hopefully initiate some kind of regime change.
Well, that seems to be, at least knowing how this regime operates, a rather distant prospect, isn't it? Do you think that Western powers might have any other options here? We know that the question of Iran has been partially dealt with. Iran has been at least temporarily subdued, also as an ally of Russia. Well, North Korea is a different case, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And I think a lot of people look at the North Korean case and say, why hasn't it been resolved more quickly? But unfortunately, we can't be entirely divisive here in terms of thinking of somehow as the West as the good guys and the rest as the bad guys, because, of course, China and the United States are in a essentially global Cold War 2.0 kind of scenario, and both China and the United States have a vested interest in sustaining North Korea as a so-called buffer state. So one of the reasons that we've seen an actual growing distaste or distance from the idea of Korean unification and the idea of forced regime change in North Korea is because there are tens of thousands of troops, American service people stationed in South Korea. There are obviously Chinese forces north of North Korea, north of the Yalu River. So the whole of North Korea acts as a kind of buffer state between those US and Chinese forces and helps to maintain the balance of power in Northeast Asia. So that is why there is not any great appetite to rock the boat and try and hugely destabilize the area by enacting forced regime change in North Korea.
So would you say that this actually still outweighs the potential problem, well, not entirely potential, it's happening right now, that North Korea is taking part in a conflict in another part of the world, delivering weapons to Russia, which are being used to kill Ukrainian civilians, essentially?
Yes, brutally truthful as that is, there is some truth to that, meaning that it's the worst of both worlds, but in one sense it's about choosing the least worst option. And at the moment, I think particularly for the United States and its allies, the idea that they would have to open up a second front is much more threatening than trying to deal with what are, after all, although a sizable, relatively limited and also extremely ineffective North Korean force in eastern Ukraine. I mean, from what we know, most of the first 12,000 troops and then the extension to 30,000 troops have either been killed or completely unable to break through Ukrainian defenses because they're poorly trained. There's a language barrier with the Russian forces. There's also a kind of distaste for the structure of the Russian military. and of course kind of mutual contempt in that respect. So as well as low morale. So these are not a very effective fighting force. What's of much greater concern, I think, is the ability for North Korea to supply Russia with artillery shells. They have already supplied, we think, something up to the figure of around 12 million shells. And this is something which allows those Russian forces to grind slowly westward across Ukraine. So really we need to be thinking about how we could intercept or affect that artillery advantage.
Would you say, therefore, that the only option for Ukraine would be to negotiate with the West the acquisition of long-range weapons which would be able to strike at supply chains? They're not going to strike at North Korea, obviously, but once these weapons are in Russia, they are fair game, so to say.
Yeah, well, we are already seeing that happen, right? One of the most kind of interesting and noticeable changes in recent weeks and months on the battlefield in Ukraine has been a switch of Ukrainian tactics towards targeting, as you say, supply lines, supply depots, arms depots, production facilities well within Russia. Because if you can strike at those before all of those forces and infrastructure reaches the battlefield, that's far more effective. And as we know, the Ukrainian conflict is one which has increasingly been defined by drone warfare. And so the ability, of course, to remove Russian drones from the battlefield, not by trying to shoot them down one by one once they're actually in the air and active, but rather at the production point, is an extremely effective tactic. And so far that seems to have been pretty telling as a way to transform the conflict. But of course, Russia will respond to this in kind. It has already resorted to mass bombing campaigns, to targeting different kinds of civilian and military infrastructure. And so the war kind of moves stage by stage, and it's about thinking about how we can more consistently knock out those weapons and production points before they reach the front line.
Ram Mason was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Lewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please stay with us for more latest news, updates and commentary.